Welcome to our Sunday School Bible study time at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is for Sunday, September the 27th. We are continuing in our study in the book of Isaiah. This week our lesson is entitled, God Reigns. God controls the rise and fall of nations and powers. Our larger scripture lesson this week is a lengthy one. It covers Isaiah 13 through Isaiah 23. And we're going to focus on the very end of that, the last part of Isaiah chapter 23. But there's a common theme to that whole section. And Warren Wiersbe entitles that section, The Burdened Prophet. And in those chapters, Isaiah presents a series of prophecies about a dozen or so different nations. So we want to take a quick look at those chapters leading up to our focal passage today. Brother Wiersbe starts his commentary by quoting from Nikita Khrushchev back in 1956, who said, "Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you." So he made that statement to a bunch of Western diplomats, but as events have developed since that time, he's gone, and the system there kind of deteriorated. So, is there a pattern to history? Is anyone in charge? The British historian Edward Gibbon called history little more than the register of crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. And sometimes as we look at events unfolding, that seems like it's an accurate description. The American missionary leader A.T. Pearson said that history is God's story. So which one is right? Well, as we're going to see today, the prophet Isaiah would stand with Pearson. For these 11 chapters that we're looking at today show God at work in the nations of the world. And in these chapters, he shows God at work in Judah, but also in these pagan nations that surrounded Judah. And so we all need to learn the lesson. World leaders particularly need to learn the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learned the hard way, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. Paul made the same kind of declaration to the Greek philosophers in Athens. God determined the times set for the nations and the exact places where they should live. So indeed, history is his story. Isaiah called these prophetic utterances burdens, and that's the way he describes them. The prophet was carrying a heavy weight or burden because of the nature of the message that he was delivering, because he was announcing judgments that involved the destruction of cities and nations, the slaughter of thousands of people. So it's no wonder that he felt burdened. In chapters 13 and the first part of chapter 14, there's a prophecy concerning Babylon. And in Scripture, Babylon symbolizes the world system that man has built in defiance of God. Now, Babylon itself, the city and the nation that developed around it, was a significant part of the ancient world for many, many years. And it had its ups and its downs. And at the time that Isaiah was writing, Babylon was relatively weak, but it's still kind of pesky there. in those days. And so the Assyrians, on more than one occasion, felt it necessary to go in and attack them. And so that's part of what he's talking about here. In fact, in 689, the Assyrians under Sennacherib completely destroyed the city of Babylon. But then Sennacherib's son rebuilt the city, and within 100 years or so of that time, we see Babylon back at the height of power under Nebuchadnezzar, and in their relations with Judah there. In the latter part of chapter 14, there's a short prophecy against Assyria, and we've talked at length in the last couple of weeks about Assyria and what happened with them. And then there's a few verses that deal with Philistia, the Philistines there. In chapters 15 and 16, there's a prophecy against Moab. The Moabites were kinfolk of the Israelites because they were descendants of Lot through an incestuous relationship that Lot had, and they were avowed enemies of the Jews. And within just a few years of this prophecy that Isaiah makes here against Moab, it was fulfilled. And Moab was destroyed and ravaged by the Assyrians. In chapter 17, there's the prophecy against Damascus and Ephraim, Syria and Israel. We talked at length about that last week there, the events that occurred there. In chapter 18, there's a prophecy against Ethiopia. Some of your translations will say Cush there. That probably was the modern day Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, that area there. Isaiah called it a land of whirring wings because of the insects that infested the land, but it's also, there was a lot of activity, frantic activity going on there as they sought alliances to protect them from Syria. So that is chapter 18. In chapter 19 and chapter 20, there's prophecy against Egypt. And the prophecy is that Egypt will be invaded and fall. And that happened in 670 BC with Esarhaddon, the Assyrian king who conquered Egypt. And in so doing, he proved that the many gods in Egypt were powerless to help. The mediums and the wizards that we're familiar of with from Genesis there were unable to give counsel. And so again, we see God triumphing over the Egyptian gods and powers there. Brother Wiersbe makes the point here out of that chapter, in these days of almost instant communication and of rapid transportation, when in a matter of minutes nations can come to the brink of war, we forget that God is still sovereign and can do whatever He pleases in the affairs of men. God destroyed everything that the Egyptians trusted, their political unity, their economy, their religion, their wisdom, and made them an easy target for the Assyrians. When the international news is frightening and you wonder where God is, he suggests we read Psalm 2 and Acts 4, 23 through 31. Acts 4, as soon as they were freed, Peter and John returned to the other believers and told them that the leading priests and elders had said, when they heard the report, all the believers lifted their voices together in prayer to God. O sovereign Lord, creator of heaven and earth and sea and everything in them. You spoke long ago by the Holy Spirit through our ancestor David, your servant, saying, why were the nations so angry? Why did they waste their time with futile plans? The kings of the earth prepared for battle. The rulers gathered together against the Lord and against his Messiah. And in fact, this has happened here in this very city. For Herod Antipas, Pontius Pilate, the governor, the Gentiles, the people of Israel were all united against Jesus, your holy servant, whom you anointed. But everything they did was anointed or determined beforehand according to your will. And now, O Lord, hear their threats and give us, your servants, great boldness in preaching your word. Stretch out your hand with healing power. May miraculous signs and wonders be done through the name of your holy servant, Jesus. So God is in control. In chapter 21, there's a prophecy against Edom. The Edomites, of course, were descendants of Esau, and that their land was that rugged land of sandstone there, very hostile to the Jews, but they fell under God's judgment. Again, in chapter 21, there's a prophecy against Arabia. And then in chapter 22, there's a prophecy against Judah and Jerusalem. Then we come to chapter 23, which is where we're going to pick up with our lesson. And that's a prophecy against Phoenicia. The Phoenicians were a merchant people, and the land they occupied is roughly equivalent to modern-day Lebanon. And they were known for their skill as seafarers. Their ships plied the Mediterranean coast, where their many colonies assured them of an abundant supply of the world's wealth. And Tyre and Sidon were the key cities here. And we see them way back in David and Solomon's time, providing building materials and workers there to them. Jezebel, who married Ahab, was a Phoenician as well. In the first 7 verses in chapter 23, we see a declaration against Tyre. Isaiah addressed ships from Spain, Tarshish, that were docked at Cyprus, telling their crews to weep and go home because Tyre was no more. Merchants from Spain, the coastlands, and even Egypt would wail because Tyre's great shipping industry was gone, and the Mediterranean economy had been devastated. The joyful cities of Tyre would become mourning refugees. And from this time, from about 700 BC, which is roughly the time frame we're talking about here, for the next 370 years, Tyre would be attacked. There would be fluctuations. There would be times when they were in a relative good position, and times when they were subjugated by different people, the Assyrians for a while, the Babylonians for a while, and finally, under Alexander the Great in 332 BC, their city completely was destroyed. The city of Tyre itself, there was a mainland portion there on the coast itself, and then was an island a little ways off the coast, and that's where part of the city was as well, and it was extremely well fortified. So it wasn't until Alexander the Great's time in 332 BC that part of the city was finally conquered and destroyed. So anyway, that's more than you want to know about all of that stuff, I'm sure. So let's look at today's lesson here. Our first part is Isaiah 23, verses 8 through 12. And we see God is just here in these verses. Who has planned this against Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants were princes, whose traders were the honored of the earth? The Lord of hosts has planned it, to defile the pride of all beauty, to despise all the honored of the earth. Overflow your land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more restraint. He has stretched his hand out over the sea. He has made the kingdoms tremble. The Lord has given a command concerning Canaan to demolish its strongholds. He has said, you shall exult no more, O crushed virgin, daughter of Sidon. Arise, pass over to Cyprus. Even there you will find no rest. So in verse 8, here we see who has planned this against Tyre. It's a rhetorical question. In the first 7 verses, as we talked about just a minute ago, Isaiah predicted the fall of Tyre and the loss of its wealth. And that statement there, that prophecy, would have been astounding to Isaiah's audience because Tyre had been wealthy and influential for a long time. Its location on that island with the strong fortifications and the fleet of ships that it had made it a formidable force. So Isaiah asks this rhetorical question. Who has planned this destruction of Tyre? We see the answer spelled out in verse 9, but we hardly need that. Only God could do such a thing. Given all the upheaval in the world during Isaiah's ministry, godly people might well have wondered, where is God in all of this? So Isaiah made it plain that God was still in control, even of places such as Tyre that were wealthy and influential. Now he says, he calls Tyre the bestower of crowns and describes their merchants as princes and their traders as honored of the earth. We don't usually associate merchants with royalty and such as that, but their reputation was such that her traders were viewed like royalty with crowns. And so that's where the description, the bestower of crowns and merchant princes, comes from. In verse 9, lest there be any doubt or confusion, Isaiah plainly stated that the Lord of hosts, or the Lord of armies, had planned it. As impressive as Tyre was, as special as they considered themselves to be, they were no match for the power of God. This verse clearly shows that God's in control of the nations. And that's the theme of all of these 11 chapters. God's plan and purpose was to desecrate and disgrace Tyre. And the reason was that common human failing pride. Isaiah never tired of saying that God was absolutely opposed to human pride in its every form. If you remember back in chapter 2, he talked about that, and it's no accident that one of his illustrations there is the cedars of Lebanon, which is the area we're talking about here. They grace the slopes behind Tyre and Sidon. Starting in verse 11 in chapter 2, the haughty eyes of humanity will be brought low, and the pride of everyone will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted on that day. For there is a day for the Lord of hosts against all of the proud and the lofty, and against all that's lifted up and humble, and against all the lofty and lifted up cedars of Lebanon, and against all the large trees of Bashan, and against all the high mountains, and against all the lofty hills, and against every kind of high tower, and against every kind of fortified wall, and against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all the ships of desire. And the haughtiness of the people shall be humbled, and the pride of everyone shall be brought low, and the Lord alone will be exalted on that day. So this is confirmation of what Isaiah said way back in chapter 2. Verse 10 is a difficult verse. It's hard to interpret, translate, and all of that. And so commentators disagree about exactly what it means. It says, "Overflow your land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more restraint." Tarshish is likely a location in Spain, and it represents the furthest reaches of their world. You may remember Tarshish is that place that Jonah fled to when he was trying to get away from God. And the connection between Tyre and Tarshish was the trade via the Mediterranean Sea. So some see the phrase, "there is no more restraint," as meaning that Tarshish would no longer be bound to Tyre in terms of the trade. There's an alternate view, though, and if you're reading from the NIV, I believe, that last phrase, instead of saying "there is no more restraint," says "there is no more safe harbor." So the word that's translated restraint there can also be translated harbor. And so in that view, Isaiah is saying that there will be no safe harbor in Tyre from ships coming from Tarshish. Either way, it talks about, again, it affirms and emphasizes God's control over these human entities. Verse 11 says, He has stretched his hand out over the sea. He has made the kingdoms tremble. The Lord has given a command concerning Canaan to demolish its strongholds. Here he brings the focus back on the Lord. And the picture of God stretching out his hand over the sea is a dramatic image, portrayal of his power and control. And that imagery is even more striking when you consider Tyre's relationship to the sea. They were some of the finest sailors of the ancient world. They controlled much of the shipping between the ports of that time, including Cyprus and Egypt and far off Spain. They were considered to be the masters of the sea. But as Isaiah shows us here, it wasn't the Phoenicians who were the masters of the sea. It was the God of Judah. And that realization made the nations tremble. The fall of Tyre would cause the nations to understand that nothing on earth lasts forever. Only God is steadfast and forever. When Isaiah talks about the Canaanite fortresses here, he's talking about Tyre. Some of your translations may say Phoenicia there. It literally is Canaan, and that's the way the Phoenicians referred to themselves, as Canaan. And so the Canaanites is kind of a general term for people in that area there. So the Lord has given a command concerning this area to demolish its strongholds, Isaiah said. He has said, "You shall exult no more, O crushed virgin, daughter of Sidon. Arise, pass over to Cyprus. Even there you will find no rest." So why call Sidon? And Sidon's the sister city with Tyre here. They're the two important cities in the Phoenician land there. And so he calls Sidon this crushed virgin daughter here. And it shows the contrast between what Sidon was and what she would become. They would no longer be like a young lady enjoying the pampered life, but they would be like someone captured and beaten down here and laid low, if you will. And even if they tried to escape from the Assyrians by finding safety among allies, like on the island of Cyprus, as he mentions here, that rest would be short-lived. Sidon's defeat by the Assyrians was inevitable, and that happened. There's a strong message for us in these verses. We can see that the Phoenicians took great pride in their wealth, their power, their mastery of the seas. And in the prophetic messages to all these nations, we see a common theme. Each of these nations had things in their culture that they were very proud of and that they were unwilling to let go of. We also know that God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. Proverbs 16:18, still true. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. So what's true of these nations can also be true in our individual lives. Most of us have things in our lives that we take great pride in, and maybe we're unwilling to give up or compromise on. So our lesson writer asks us to consider how we have put our trust in the structure and the institutions of our life. It's an appropriate question, and it's one that we need to consider carefully, and we need to ask it repeatedly in our lives, because there is that temptation to put our trust in structure, institutions, things, resources, all of those things that we see these nations depending on. In verses 13 and 14, we see that God is active. Verse 13, he says, behold, the land of the Chaldeans. This is the people which was not. Assyria appointed it for desert creatures. They erected their siege towers. They stripped its palaces. They made it a ruin. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for your stronghold is destroyed. The land of the Chaldeans is Babylon. And Babylon was a major force for many, many years. As I said before, the Assyrians attacked Babylon on multiple occasions. I think Sargon II besieged them, and he talks about here they erected their siege towers and they stripped its palaces. So they did lay siege to Babylon on more than one occasion. Sargon II, like I say, in 710, I think Sennacherib down about 701, 700, and finally in 689, the Assyrians destroyed Babylon after a long siege. And it took many years for Babylon to rebuild and again become a prominent nation in that area. We know that that happened because it'll be the Babylonians that ultimately conquer Judah and carry the people of Judah into captivity. So, in verse 14, he says, wail, O ships of Tarshish, for your stronghold is destroyed. Verse 14 brings the prophecy full circle. If you look at verse 1, it begins, wail, ships of Tarshish, for the house is destroyed so that no one can enter. So the ships here are personified as if they're alive. And they're a metaphor for the loss of the port and the trade of Tyre. Even though Tyre was well protected, it was on an island, it had tall fortified walls, they would not stand against the judgment of God. And history tells us the rest of the story. They were besieged many times, and each time they suffered losses. But because of its location and fortifications, it was able to survive until the time of Alexander the Great. 332 BC, Alexander the Great took the rubble from the destruction of the mainland portion of the city and used that to build a causeway out to the island fortifications, and then was able to overcome the city and destroy it. And Tyre never recovered its former glory after that. Verses 15 through 18. Now in that day, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, like the days of one king. At the end of 70 years, it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the harlot. Take your harp, walk about the city, O forgotten harlot. Pluck the strings skillfully. Sing many songs, that you may be remembered. It will come about at the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre. Then she will go back to her harlot's wages and will play the harlot with all the kingdoms on the face of the earth. Her gain and her harlot's wages will be set apart to the Lord. It will not be stored up or hoarded, but her gain will become sufficient food and choice attire for those who dwell in the presence of the Lord. In that day, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, like the days of one king. 70 years symbolizes a full measure of time or lifetime. So some interpret this verse as being kind of symbolic here in saying Tyre would be forgotten for just the right amount of time for justice to be carried out. And that kind of fits with what Isaiah here says, in that day Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, like the days or the lifetime of one king. But there's a more literal interpretation as well, because from about 700 BC, when Sennacherib and Assyria was attacking and subjecting Tyre, down to about 630 BC, 70-year period there. Tyre's trade was crippled, and they were not able to engage in the business activity that they had done so prominently for all those years. About 630, when Assyria declined, they were able to resume some of that trade, especially there with Judah. Either way, whether you interpret it literally or symbolically, the key idea is that Tyre would receive full justice from God, and the punishment would be fitting. Now, he says at the end of 70 years it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the harlot, and then verse 16, we have the song of the harlot. Take your harp, walk around the city, O forgotten harlot. Pluck the strings skillfully, sing many songs, that you may be remembered. So, perhaps that song was well known in Isaiah's day. We really don't know. But it portrays an aging prostitute who is reduced to picking up a musical instrument and trying to attract attention as a musician of sorts. And so the implication there is that Tyre, once forgotten, would have to resort to other means to attract a small portion of the attention that she once had. It reminds us, all of this reminds, if you look in Revelation 17 and 18, John's revelation there uses both Babylon and Tyre, and the symbolism is of a prostitute. Chapter 17, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke with me, saying, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute, who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed sexual immorality, and those who live on the earth became drunk with the wine of her sexual immorality. And He carried me away into the wilderness in the Spirit, and I saw a woman seated on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, holding a golden cup in her hand full of detestable things and the unclean things of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the detestable things of the earth. And it goes on, and he uses Tyre as well in this. So in verse 17 it says, it will come about at the end of the 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre. Then she will go back to her harlot's wages and play the harlot with all the kingdoms on the face of the earth. So history tells us that even though the Assyrians restricted trade from 700 to 630 BC, at about that time frame, Tyre and Sidon revived their businesses. And again, here he compares that revival of their business to this aging prostitute who had to sing these songs to get attention. And so apparently their shipping business here was not as easy or as lucrative as it once was. Verse 18 is a promise. Her gain and her harlot's wages will be set apart to the Lord. It will not be stored up or hoarded, but her gain will become sufficient food and choice attire for those who dwell in the presence of the Lord. With a change of tone, Isaiah here reveals that ultimately it was God's purpose that this richest pagan city, symbolized here by Tyre, would be pagan no longer and would dedicate its resources to the worship of God. Now, many see that as looking ahead to the Messianic kingdom, when the wealth would not be hoarded, but would be given to the Lord as a holy offering. Summation here kind of in these chapters. It's kind of a difficult thing maybe to bring this down to us and to make it pertinent to us, because we see all these stories about these ancient peoples that we really don't care much about here. And it seems a pretty obvious thing that, yes, God's in control and God punished them. So what can we learn from these? Well, Warren Wiersbe says our trek through these 11 chapters has taught us some important lessons. First of all, God's in control of the nations of the world, and He can do with them what He pleases. Though the mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceedingly small. Frederick von Logau. Second, God especially hates the sin of pride. And all through Isaiah we see that. Chapter 13, chapter 16, chapter 23. Back in Proverbs we saw that. And I'm not going to take the time to read those passages, but we've seen that. So when nations turn from the living God to trust their wealth and their armaments, God must show them that He's their only sure refuge. Third, God judges the nations for the way they treat each other. Judah's the only nation here mentioned that had God's law, and yet God held these other Gentile nations accountable for what they did. For as many as have sinned without law will also perish without law, Paul says in Romans 2:12. And then finally, God always gives a word of promise and hope to His people. Babylon will fall, but God will care for Judah. Moab will not accept sanctuary from Jerusalem, but God will one day establish His throne there. Assyria and Egypt may be avowed enemies of the Jews, but one day the three nations will together glorify God. So, no matter how frightening the national or international situation may become, God's children can have peace because they know Almighty God's on His throne. The nations may rage and plot against God, but as Psalms 2:4 says, He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. So, we can be comforted with all of that. Very quickly, Max Lucado has a little blurb in his commentary, in his Encouraging Word Bible on this chapter. He says, Isaiah foretold the destruction of Jerusalem and Tyre. Both cities would be destroyed for ignoring God and trusting in their own ingenuity. When faced with a dilemma, ask God for His help and guidance rather than depending on your own resources. The greatest example of humility is none other than Jesus Christ, who had more reason to boast than He, yet He never did. He walked on water, but never strutted on the beach. He turned a basket into a buffet, but never demanded applause. A liberator and a prophet came to visit Him, but He never dropped names in His sermon. He could have. Just the other day I was conferring with Moses and Elijah. But Jesus never thumped His chest. He refused even to take credit. By myself I can do nothing, John 5:30. He was utterly reliant upon the Father and the Holy Spirit. All by myself. Jesus never spoke such words. If He didn't, how dare we? We can rise too high, but we can never stoop too low. What gift are you giving that He did not first give? What truth are you teaching that He didn't first teach? You love, but who loved you first? You serve, but who served the most? What are you doing for God that He could not do alone? How kind of Him to use us. How wise of us to remember. Pride can keep us from asking God for help. Are you too self-confident, too self-assured? God asks you to give up your self-dependence and give Him your heart. And that's the thrust of these burdens of these nations that Isaiah uttered. And finally, two poems. I'm not a poet, but sometimes I find poems that I like. John Oxenham, the English poet back in the 1500s, he wrote a little poem. He wrote a bunch of poems, but he wrote a little poem called God's Handwriting. He writes with characters too grand for our short sight to understand. We catch but broken strokes and try to fathom all the mystery of withered hopes, of death, of strife. But there, with larger, clearer sight, we shall see this: His way was right. And then William Cowper, he's spelled C-O-W-P-E-R, he wrote some hymns, but he wrote a poem that was turned into a hymn. The poem was called Light Shining Out of Darkness. The hymn, God Moves in Mysterious Ways. And the poem, the first part of it, goes like this: God moves in a mysterious way, His wonders to perform. He plants His footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Very appropriate for Tyre here. Deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, He treasures up His bright designs and works His sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. So, all of these things tell us God's in control and wants us to trust the promises that He's made to us. And we can trust those promises.